Sorry for the technical delays. We are going to be kicking off right now with an opening appropriate for the day because it is International Women's Day, and we want to celebrate the role of women within pastoralism, within our wider world, and we're going to invite
Of care. They attend funerals, organize weddings, feed their neighbors, exchange goods, care for the sick and children. They wake up at 4 a.m. in the morning, milk the animals, make cheese, cook a feast. They sell milk by the roadside or exchange experiences and information at the local markets. Pastoral economies. Their strength and power, their abilities and patience live without words. And yet, they are killed, disrespected, oppressed, beaten up. Abuse and discrimination. In this day dedicated to the women's struggles, women's power, and women's rights, we condemn all forms of abuse and oppression, still too frequent in rural areas, in pastoral and farming communities. We stand in solidarity with all the women who struggle. We continue to strive for equal rights and to celebrate women's power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abdir. And welcome everyone online. Again, apologies for the delay in getting going. We're welcoming you back, if you were here with us on Monday, to what is has been an incredibly rich discussion here in Addis Ababa. We've been discussing how and in what ways we can shift the narratives around pastoralism to benefit pastoralists more effectively across the world. We've had contributions from 4 different continents. We've had discussions around many different themes. And today we're bringing this back and welcoming you online to a discussion about where do we go next? What are the ways forward? What are the practical implications of shifting this narrative about pastoralism and shifting it in a way that moves us away from thinking that pastoralism is always a backward system that's in need of modernization or in need of transformation, or indeed encouraging people to get out of pastoralism. How can we develop a pastoralism that is sustainable, that is productive, that delivers for men and women and young people into the future? Because although there are many, many challenges within pastoral settings, and we've heard about them during the workshop, there are many, many opportunities too. And that's what we want to concentrate in the session today. So the format of this is we're going to have a number of different presentations on 4 themes that we've been focusing on mobility, on land and environment, on markets, and finally on disaster responses and the role of social protection and insurance in particular. And we hope that everybody will engage with these discussions and come up with questions that can be posed or comments that you want to make. Please add them into the chat if you're online, and we will try our best to collate them and get them responded to. during the session. After the first four presentations, and I'll introduce the speakers as they come, we will have a series of commentaries from people from different parts of the world, reflecting on how this debate resonates with their own experiences and their own settings. So without further ado, I want to hand over first to the group who have been working on mobilities. Group. I'm sure she would say this, she's just simply representing the group, is Annabelle Powell, who is program manager at Acting for Life, who's been working with, and the organization's been working with agro-pastoral civil society organizations in West Africa over the past 10 years. So Annabelle, I will try and open your...
Laying out a background that was applicable to pretty much everyone in our context of when we think about mobility. What is it? Well, it's practiced at various scales. It can be short, it can be long, it can be for long distances across country, it can be across international borders. And it mainly relies on local knowledge and local institutions. Around mobility, as we all know, and it's been talked about a lot before, is that mobility is associated directly often with conflict, insecurity, and therefore a lot of policies around it are centered around controlling mobility and largely sedentarizing mobile communities. At some level of acknowledgement in a formulation of policies, for example, in the African Union, the policy framework on pastoralism, IGAD, Trans-Humanist Protocol, and ECOWAS, obviously in West Africa with the freedom of movement, and that there are various country level legislations also that can be applicable. But as we all know, the problem is often in implementation. And what does this actually mean on the ground for pastoralists? And is it adapted? Be practical on the ground, and obviously in light of policy making, you really need to think about what's concrete, what can we actually do, and keeping in mind the contextual impact. Obviously, we're talking in our group, we had representatives from Kenya, Ethiopia, India, and myself outside of PASTRES from West Africa. It was just coming together to try and bring together certain ideas that everyone wanted to talk about around mobility and policy. In light of these new narratives. And one clear aspect that came out early on was the need for mapping of grazing routes and resources, because this helps us better understand mobility and what mobility is, And in particular, once we've mapped these resources, not only are we able to say how land is being used, that it's not unused land and available for other purposes, but also it allows us to better orientate investment. So once we hopefully get the buy-in for investment, we know where that investment should be made, which makes sense to the pastoral community and can be often used as shared resources between pastoral communities and local communities. This requires our access to the primary information and data. And then a question about how we represent this. So a lot of it was about building capacity to do GIS, to represent maps using GIS data. Another question that came out a lot in our group was what scale is relevant and where should this data be hosted? Alongside that, there's whose responsibility is it in order to update this data and how is it going to be used? We then sort of, with all of the different action points, we were looking at, okay, what could be the possible risks of this? How could this policy be misused or not used in the way that we were hoping in terms of pastoral interests and mobile community interests? And one of those reflections was on, if we create maps, does that create a certain amount of rigidity? And also, once you've said where the resources are, does it create increased competition for those resources? So we wanted to just make it a little bit more dynamic and give some examples of maps that have been used and what we found really interesting in our discussions. So this was one that was presented on the IGAD region, where you can see both the movement of animals, of herds, as well as the sort of livestock corridors that we would say they use in general. And that's at the large regional scale. And then some examples that we have from West Africa, where we're looking at the more local scale. Local, I mean by trans-border zones, rather than at the regional level. And hopefully looking at that makes it easier for it to be more applicable and more used by local communities, whereas the IGAD one is a little bit more difficult for actual pastoral communities to use. This is important because here in this map, you can see that not only have we mapped the mobility of herds, but also the changing use of that land as a result of different elements like the conflict zones that you can see in the red sort of star-like, and how now herds are moving further and further south in the blue area, which explains a little bit of the change in land usage. And then you can expand on why that's happening. And it's pastoral communities that really know that. The same as this one for Benin, which shows the circles are the zones of conflict, and we see the pastoral resources. That's interesting because 2 years before that, on the same map, there was only 1 or 2 little spots. So it's a really useful advocacy tool for pastoralist communities as well, to explain what's happening in their zone. We then came to talking about supporting innovation. So facilitating access to services, for example, with portable solar power for pumping water and powering needed devices. And we had a bit of a long conversation also about smart IDs. It's an idea that we all shared, actually, that is a little bit, we see a little bit in each different context, but there were different opinions on whether this was a good thing and whether this should be used or not, because of the risks of it seen as also another way of controlling and knowing who they are, and that kind of continuing that thought process that about pastoralists, which is perhaps not in the new narratives perspective, but also thinking about it being useful on the ground. I know that there are various different situations where this is actually permits mobility. It helps herders convince people that are nervous about who they are, that who they are improves who they are and how many animals they're coming with, and it can actually allow them to be mobile. Then we discussed systems for access to market services, which obviously links closely to the group that were looking at markets, and about the importance of market information on how that can best be used. Why is market information collection of that data interesting and important is because when we're trying to argue for increased mobility or for facilitating mobility or investing in mobility, all pastoralists or agro-pastoralists will have some link to a market. They need to have access to markets. And so in collecting this data, they're able to show the interest, both economically, of having pastoralist mobility, because there is lots of animals that are coming to the market, and therefore lots of money that's coming into that local environment. So it's a really important advocacy tool. But also can disprove certain policies. For example, we talked about in our group, in Benin, they recently had a policy in 2021 about sedentarizing pastoralists. With access to this market data, our partners were able to show that mobility continued. There were still animals coming onto the market despite certain policies to sedentarize. So it brings back questions about these policies that are about controlling and gives actual information and data behind it. So it's empowering for pastoral communities. Long discussion about access to real-time information and what that meant, using different examples. So the ability to know what's going on in the region, whether there's water at a certain water point, whether there's conflict in a certain area, and how pastoral communities can use that. Some people, it's difficult because we want real-time access to information, but also there was a question about how this actually works for pastoral communities and does it undermine their existing strategies. And then Natasha came up with an example actually of in India where, yes, it can undermine their strategies, but at the same time, often that is incorporated into their responses to these. So it's an interesting discussion. I'll try and go a little bit quicker. Adopting service provisions to the mobile nature of pastoralist communities. And we had a lot of examples of this from India and what they've been doing about mobile schools. It's an interesting discussion because there's a lot of experience that's happened in different areas as well. Particularly, I know in West Africa, I know in other areas in East Africa, perhaps as well, where this perhaps hasn't worked. So I think it's important, well, in our group, we thought it was important to look at where it has worked and the differences, but also the acknowledgement of the importance of this. And then recognizing informal and flexible collective pooling of resources as a way to enhance mobility. Say what this meant for us as a group, having thought about all of these things and what links all of these together. It's really reframing the discussion in light of the new narratives around pastoralism, and about looking at from people being static to the state being mobile in its provision of services. And what would this look like? And what's the role of the pastoral community and the role of the state within this? And an example was given of how you can bridge that gap between them. So the importance of the state services knowing what's going on and that being an open dialogue. And there's an example in West Africa where they formally contract with a pastoral organization and the local government authority to actually formalize this relationship. And it's not a free service. They're experts. They know what they're doing and that they should be appreciated for that as well, but also openly working with the state institutions to better inform the policy. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Annabelle. That was a fantastic summary of a day and a half of intense discussions. And so nice to have West African examples brought in to enrich our discussions. So we're going to move on now to looking at another huge area, which of course overlaps, something we've been discussing this morning, and how all of these policy themes overlap, is how to think about land and the environment. And we've got two people, while I try and find the presentation, we've got two people presenting for this one. First is Ryan Unks, who is a research fellow at the European University Institute currently. He's a landscape ecologist, has worked a long time in East Africa, including in Kenya, and is an affiliate with the PASTRES program. So I'm going to hand over immediately to Ryan, who will take it from here. If I can get this up, and I get it to present a view. Over to you. So for you, you've got 10 minutes.
So as Ian referenced, we had a very rich discussion in our group. And I hope that I'm able to distill some key points from that, but I'm sure that there are certain points that I will miss as well. So forgive that, perhaps we can come back to them in the Q&A, but just to highlight the various contexts, these different contexts that we were speaking across in our group between Kenya and East Africa more generally, but also China, India, and Mediterranean Europe. There were some key similarities that really came out, and tensions between the way the pastoralists see themselves and the way the government sees them, and disconnects between systems of land and legislation, leading to tensions between the ability of pastoralists to influence decisions according to their needs and to secure access rarely exists. The ability to secure access rarely exists for settled areas as well as seasonal areas, and the importance of both of these types of access. But also this especially can be seen, these tensions can be seen between mainstream policy frameworks and the needs of pastoralists and other interests such as industrial development, cash crop agriculture, mining, wind power, and solar development, where these policy interests have greater leverage than herding and livestock keeping. And so just to briefly summarize the Kenyan context, there are new tensions around Community Land Act that's come into play. And really there's a disconnect with how it's being implemented and practices on the ground, with some similarities to India, where the Forest Rights Act has come into effect, but then pastoralists aren't always actually able to access forest lands in practice. And then contrasting with China as well, where the state has the strong centralized state is really allocates land contracts to individual households. And then the way that plays out on the ground is, of course, variable. And these all contrast with the Mediterranean European context, where land abandonment is really the key issue. And so then also talking about similarities in environmental outcomes and ecological outcomes specifically is the issue of woody encroachment and land degradation, which is, of course, often attributed to pastoralists, which highlights the importance of attention to pastoral knowledge that also often contradicts these narratives. But there's a need for other types of ecological knowledge as well, asking more appropriate questions to highlight how pastoralism is interacting with the environment. So, but then just highlighting some of the dominant narratives, which I won't repeat here. We tried to produce alternative narratives to a lot of these dominant narratives, and thinking about changing the narrative to pastoralists as empowered citizens, connected to, in important ways, to speaking in terms of food sovereignty, but also needed shifts away from being seen as temporary land users. And so moving from being seen as land users to being with land, which can really create a movement away static categories of private and commons, but still emphasizing land relations as more shared, collective, and inclusive, and in contrast with privatized and national state land systems as exclusionary practices themselves. But then highlighting how pastoralists themselves are working to become an empowered group who aren't averse to different types of investments and changes in the way land is used, but then really taking a context-based approach and centering pastoralism as a production system. There's a need to move away from talking about pastoralists as stakeholders, but emphasizing them as experts and centering pastoralists as people who are experts in these production systems. And also moving away from stigmatizations around conflict. Then this really connects to the environmental narratives of starting from current relationships with land. What services the current relationships with land are providing in terms of biodiversity and carbon sequestration, but also moving from protection to plurality of relations with land, and acknowledging that there are multiple complex land production systems or food production systems, and moving to multiple types of valorization. So centering pastoral knowledge, but also ecological knowledge.
Ryan, thank you very much. And we're going to, for the second half of the presentation, it's over to Rashmi Singh, who has been a PhD scholar at the School of Human Ecology in Ambedkar University. And She's also a postdoc affiliate of the PASTRES program and current and soon to be communications support person. 5 minutes more.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Ryan, for the background. So I will now be moving to how we can change narratives in the policy arena. To create, yesterday we had a lot of discussion, and out of some of the important points were first to create an interface between pastoralists and policy practitioners and the government. It is critical to understand that the regional and national government's priorities and aligning those priorities with the pastoral production and livelihoods. There is certainly a requirement for a critical understanding of state's objective for rangeland and pastoralism while dealing with land and environment theme. There's also a need to understand whether pastoralism is too complex to understand or the state makes it intentionally look complex so that they don't have to deal with the integrities of the requirement of pastoralists. After an understanding of the government, there's also a need to understand the process of policy making. As we all know that the policies are made for one sector, and pastoralism is not restricted to one sector, but multi-sectors like commerce, tribal affairs, animal husbandry, and of course the environment sector. And the policymakers should therefore take a multi-scalar approach for crafting successful policies. And one of the successful examples are from the creation of pastoral cell in India, which has members from all these ministries. It is essential that both actors asking for pastoral policies and policymaker emphasize on the social, cultural, and economical diversity within the pastoral community in any given context. Another important point is the identification of locally important actors, which may vary. We have seen from yesterday's presentation that they may vary from context to context. The social stratification, what is also critical in understanding in the terms of land and environment, is the understanding of the local ecologies and the dynamic of resource use across the space and time. Most important of all, as emerged in the discussion yesterday, is a cohesion and alliance not between the pastoral communities, but also the non-pastoral communities, the smallholders, fishermen, forest dwellers, who have similar concerns like loss of land, access to land and environment, which can help in creating critical mass for the large national and international collectives. So till now I spoke on what to be done, but from the experiences yesterday, we know that people have been doing policy advocacy for some time, and we can learn from the constraints that they have mentioned, which includes the lack of platform at the national level, alliance between the organization. And when the state even wants to engage with the pastoral communities, it often results in widening the existing gaps between the small and large herders, because they often engage with the elite pastoralist community members, which results in local social conflict. And there's this problem of disorganized evidence. Even if policymaker wants to access the evidence, there's no organized access to the local evidence. Other than these external constraints, there are internal constraints as well. What if the pastoral communities themselves don't want to continue pastoralism? And what do we do in that scenario? And do we really need to do anything in that scenario? Now, moving from what can be done and how can be done, what are the larger points coming in the land and environment perspective is concrete policies need to focus on pastoral communities as differentiated with the range of land rights, social structures, and knowledge system, not as stakeholders as you also mentioned in the earlier presentation, but the experts at the center. Here it is important to acknowledge the heterogeneity among the pastoral communities. For example, a case from Sikkim, there are 4 different kinds of communities who access different areas in terms of altitude. And if you really want to engage them, you need to know that which land area, which environment they have knowledge to. So engage them at that level for policy advocacy. It is important to realize the social as well as ecological local stratification and realities which are moving with the larger phenomenon of climate change and globalization and development. And hence policies should be revisited, reviewed, and revised time to time to relate with the local realities. New policies therefore need to center pastoralism as a production system that support both livelihood and biodiversity across the complex landscape that the current policies miss out somewhere. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Ryan and Rashmi. We're going to now move on to a theme that has been very much part of the discussions, which is on markets. I'm going to welcome to the podium the Dr. Guyoruba, who is a natural scientist by background, environmental scientist, worked a lot on markets, and he is currently the head of the Jamil Observatory based at ILRI, Policies, Institutions and Livelihoods Program. And before this, he held positions at IFAD, at IUCN, and at Kipra in Kenya. So, great person to present on behalf of the group. And I now have to find your presentation.
Thank you very much. I'll speak to the marketing issues as discussed by my group members. I think before I go into the main part of the presentation, in this group, we took a quick round through the continental perspective and experiences from Europe, Africa, and Asia. And one of the fundamental things we found out is the diversity of issues within the same cross-cutting pastoral marketing issue. Okay, so if you look at the northern Kenya or the Horn of Africa, part of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia, there's a lot of evolution around traditional market chains, which are largely based on the social networks. You could see camel milk, which is traditionally a taboo in terms of commercialization, making its way through a social web of network from, for example, Isiolo in Kenya to Isli in Nairobi, working through kinship, network, and trust. But then when you look at the investment regime in the region, you also see the emergence of the mega abattoirs, which is ideally to regionalize the long supply chains. There's mixed result around this in terms of how much we have achieved in terms of organizing the trade. And there are good lessons in terms of the investment versus the benefit. Going closer to European Union, I think one of the things we found from the group is the change in the sheep wool value chain, where I think there's a general shift from the natural fiber to more synthetic recycled fiber, which means that people who are predominantly producing natural fiber will have less to benefit from the market. And then, of course, there's also interesting emergence of the use of the geographical indicators to commercialize cattle milk in Turkey. And this is in the face of inflation and everything, has managed to do that. But then the other two aspects, one is the link between non-pastoral animals providing, animals for fattening schemes. This is a new emerging thing, which shows the complementarity between the pastoral and agro-pastoral systems. So in summary, in the group, we realized there's nothing called the single perspective of the market, but it depends on the different arrangement, depending on the dynamics and issues within the particular continent. So quickly, we characterize the geographical or what you call continental issues at this level. One, I think in Africa, large part of Africa, we're still dealing with the systemic issues around market, basically a bit of some of the rudimentary issues around taxation, market information flow between downstream and upstream. Clear, every part has this market information asymmetry. And then, of course, in some countries, policies have been established, which is completely working against pastoralism in terms of market commercialization. But then there are others where policies have been made for them, but then somehow institutional evolution has stuck in the middle, like in Kenya, I think, with the marketing board taking almost 10 years to fully operationalize. And of course, the lack of market differentiation is one of the big issue when animals produced in pastoral areas have this tender meat and is sought after, but nobody's paying the premium in terms of price for differentiated value and quality. And that also linked to Asia in terms of the quality not recognized. At the same time, I think cross-cutting between Asia and Africa is that as we push for standardization output, that simultaneously means that you're standardizing input, which basically takes us to sort of range scheme where you look at animal genetics, uniform finish, and etc. In Europe, I think the center of all many things, but the thing animal health and safety and animal welfare is key. But then they also have similar issues that we have in terms of power concentration in the long part of the node of the chain, in terms of producers not having the right decision to position for standards and norms. Quickly on the cross-cutting issues, there are quite a number. I think some of them are already mentioned. One is the requirements for constant supply and quality do not really appreciate pastoral variability. Our production systems is based on the heterogeneous landscape, which has patchy resources, and it's more multifunctionality of the land than a homogeneous landscape, which gives you a uniform standardization and finishing. The second one is around standards and norms. We're pushing for reconfiguration from extensive to intensive, sometimes inadvertently, by pushing for standard that is not focused on people who produce. Top-down planning, I think I won't say much around. This is investments that are made completely in absence of people's input. So this leads to bad policies, sometimes policies that work against the ethos of commercialization. And then, of course, the infrastructure is a big issue. Investments done at a different level, but then sometimes the input of the people who need the service, their priorities in terms of unlocking certain issues in the value chain is completely missed in developing the infrastructure, whether it's a locational issue, whether it's this, engagement with the infrastructure and other things. Power concentration, power relation is very important in all the places. I think pastoralists or producers bear the cost of complex logistics, but then they don't necessarily benefit from the complexity of conveying animal from one corner to a central node. Good. Now, there are a number of sticky issues in livestock marketing. I think the first one is the market engagement benefits. Of course, we all agree that, but then for whom is an important question that I think we always grapple with. And that speaks to the issues I raised earlier. Who decides how cost and benefit are distributed or shared? That is a big issue in terms of when you look at the profit and loss margin across the chain, it will always tell you who makes these decisions. And of course, we seldom consult pastoralists when deciding on market infrastructure. And I think I already mentioned that. I don't need to emphasize. Low pastoralist participation in setting standards and norms that regulates their own product. I think there are a lot of standards. I think Kenya has, through Kenya Bureau of Standard, we even have the animal sizes very much defined, but I have no clue whether anybody knows that standard has been passed almost, I think, 10 or 11 years ago in Kenya, grade 1 to 4. We use eyeball assessment to look at the animals, opening the animal's mouth to count the number of teeth, all those kind of funny things that people do in the market. Lastly, I think is on these are certainly bigger policy implications. And this is not exhaustive, but I think we try to categorize this policy implication at 3 levels. One, I think, is on these standards and norms. There's a twin side of standard and norm. If you get it right through participatory processes, pastoralists have chances to position themselves to benefit from standard and norms. But if you do the other way around, then it hangs and it's working in isolation. And that is an issue. Infrastructure definitely, I think, has potential of generating inclusive or exclusive, basically value chain. But that depends also, again, how do we design infrastructure? And this is a big issue, big infrastructure issues. In Kenya, an example of doing a modular cooler for camel milk versus doing a mega one has different results. The modular one done in Nanyuki, I think, died within the first birthday. The other ones have really worked because it's small, it is efficient, it is used by different people. And I think that's a very good demonstration. And it's also very cheap to do this kind of thing. And lastly, I think, is the policy framework. Although in many cases, policies have evolved and not necessarily work against pastoralists, but it doesn't consider them as much as we think. I think, and very good example is Kenya, I think, passed many years ago, ASAL policy with fantastic institutions in there. It has not moved an inch. I think only one institution was operationalized, all the rest. So now we're talking maybe updating the policy again. So these are all issues that need to be considered, and I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Buyo. I think a lot of themes there that resonate all over the world. Markets are not neutral. They're thoroughly political. They're thoroughly social. And even infrastructure seems like a good thing, but it depends how you build it and where you build it and for whom. So thank you, Buyo, and the wider markets team. So now we're going to have the final of the 4 presentations before our commentaries. And we've got 2 very good presenters. I'd say that because they've recently completed their PhDs with the PASTRES program. First is Masresha Tai, who is an economist by background, but now I'm very much a multidisciplinary development studies person, I'm glad to say. And he's currently a postdoc at the University of Amsterdam. And then immediately after, right at the end, is Tahira Mohammed. Is that correct? Yeah, Tahira. Who is, we haven't got this right. Why aren't we doing this right? We'll finish the presentation off. Anthropologist who's been working on moral economies in Kenya. Masresha, over to you. 10 minutes before.
Thank you so much, Ian. Good afternoon, all. I'm representing the social protection and insurance team that has been discussing a lot of issues. Luckily, we are a mix of researchers, practitioners, government people from Asia and Africa. So it's quite a nice process. And as Ian said, Tahira worked on a social protection in Kenya. I did my PhD on insurance. So it was quite a right mix to reflect some of the issues. So most of the discussions from our team relies on asking questions and then not totally to reinvent the wheel, but rather what are the practices. So we posed the first question, how do we make the states support mobile, which is pastoralists in our sense. And our main focus, like I said, is social protection and insurance, which means these are external interventions that we tried to interrogate. And these questions are, which I'm going to present, are on the underlying assumptions of these external interventions and what practices have we captured as researchers, practitioners, and policymakers from the ground. And the second one is what can be taught out a bit the broader framework of social protection and insurance when we think about that. And then lastly, going forward, what would be the policy implications? So in general, why these social protection and insurance assumptions do not fit well with the pastoral practice was the first and foremost question we should ask. And we try to categorize what are the assumptions when these external stakeholders come in the pastoral system and what are actually the actual practices that we see. So to start with, it is mostly assumed there is a single crisis, in our case, drought, for example, in a pastoral system, both for insurance or any other humanitarian intervention, emanates from that singularity of risk or, for that matter, drought. But not only such event is singular, it is also stated like in a more centralized way, and hence the deliveries are intended in that single place, in that single occurrence of that assumed risk and uncertainty. Not only that, these are also static across space and time. That's why these are devised in this way, and there is a strong feeling of coordination among. However, there is unfolding and compounding uncertainty, and such events, as we know, are not static. They evolve over space and time. The assumption that, okay, there is a risk, there is a crisis happening, so we should address an individual. But as we can understand from what is on the ground, this goes beyond. Asset is not owned individually, but rather it cuts across families, team members, relatives in a collective way. And hence, what we call it in the model, Ian said that, I mean, in the economists or remote sensing scientists, this coverage risk goes beyond what it is assumed initially, not only for insurance, but also for all other humanitarian crises that all actors are intervening. Finally, there is like implementation failures. What we can understand from all these assumptions is that in a pastoral system where among the external actors, there is implementation failures. For example, a lot of insurance schemes in Ethiopia, just one example that since I have been working for the last 7-8 years, in one region, you would see 3-4 external actors trying to dump the insurance product, or either market-based or either as part of a social protection. And it has created not only inequality among some, but also confusion, because what kind of insurance and by whom and for whom? So these are some of the implementation failures. And these are actually, in general, the context is fragmented, and people in different places pay quite a different amount of prices. So all in all, there is a mismatch between the assumed social protection and insurance practice with that of the actual pastoral practices that we're able to understand from across different activities. So if that's the case, what can we do about it? So we asked ourselves from the previous table I just presented that what key aspects should be taught out to overcome this mismatch between the assumed and the actual practices of pastoralists. Like I said, we were lucky that we have a mix of different people, so that can we start with the ideal perspective or can we start with the actual? So that was the first question to come. So our intention, when you see this a bit complex framework, is not to revolutionize the whole external intervention, but rather, is there any aha moment that we can provide? So it starts with strengthening resilience from the below. That's the theme that we just wanted to introduce here. So our focus is divided into a number of aspects, but social protection and insurance, as I keep saying, is what we are trying to present here. So the first question is what an effective social protection system looks like in a pastoral setting. This is an important question that we asked it ourselves. We design social protection systems in a different perspective. So this social assistance, it cuts across a collective, sometimes mobile and flexible, and the timing and even the earlier presentations, as you have seen, the on-demand basis are the key features and aspects that we should start thinking. And then going to insurance, like I said earlier, one of the failure is it's very individualized, but can we make it a bit collective? And what about the timings? Because it assumes that there is a specific period of making payouts, but can that be flexible also? So we kind of feel in this arena that there is a practical, pragmatic way of thinking through insurance, including the valuation, the risk, the peril, all others. Finally, the third component is the asset protection, which is more pragmatic aspect that we are thinking. In this, although we can list several aspects of the asset protection from on the ground, let's say local fodder banks, supplementary feeding, and restocking, vet services, and other contingent funding come into play. But all other, because one of the challenges is the timing, and the principle that we are having is timing is quite important. It cuts across all these three, from the regular or the day-to-day up to the asset building or the emergency activities, all these three. And then finally, this can be also embedded in several institutional coordination activities. This is where actually the local practices that we think are important. This is the coordination of early warning and early anticipatory systems, and bringing together the scientific and the local knowledge, deliberation and coordination of these activities in a way that this extending from not only emergency activities, but also both a mix of, because we believe the early warning and early action are something that can be embedded. So, okay, will this be more idealistic? We believe no. We ended our discussion by bringing some of the way forward. The first one is that social protection and insurance is linked to anticipatory action and resulting from, like I said earlier, early warning system. And despite quite an massive investment in these systems, there is a huge gap that, as we feel from our discussion. And what can science answer, and what actually pastoralists need, is where we see us as a point of deviation. So equally, these local practices and indigenous knowledge are quite important. And there is one important example Tahira suggested. I'm just running some of her PowerPoint. I'm asked by Tahira to run through her PowerPoint. So Tahira provided one good example that in Moyale sub-county in Kenya, a very micro-level national drought management by NDMA, and in conjunction with another local NGO, Community Initiative and Facilitation Authority, CIFA, recognized the significance of shared knowledge with participatory scenario planning, and linked this into an early warning information to manage drought in the pastoral system. And then there is a social assistant should be focused at providing support at particular moment for keeping like breeding or herd or stock in a stable amid in a wide array of drought. Finally, such social assistance for herd protection through restocking or feed and supplement and fodder supply and social assistance should support the local network. And this is where the high reliability professional should be embedded going forward in terms of social protection and insurance. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Masresha. And thank you for doing Tahira's bit at the end. So as you can see, we have been discussing 4 huge areas. And each of these areas have thrown up a massive number of questions, a massive number of ideas. But each of them, each of the groups, I think, has done a very successful job of thinking through, quite concretely, what a shift in the narrative from the old narrative that we discussed, particularly on Monday, to the new narrative around pastoralism. What does taking variability, taking uncertainty, taking flexibility, taking adaptability and mobility seriously, what does it mean? It doesn't mean throwing out everything that we've done before. For example, social protection and insurance have to be rethought, but not abandoned. Markets are still important interventions, but not in the way that are very often implemented. Land development and tenure support has to be rethought. We've got a lot of work to do, but I think the discussions so far in the meeting have thrown up some quite interesting and important ways forward. So what I'm going to do now is invite 4 people to the table in front to offer very briefly some brief comments from their perspectives. I'll introduce them in turn on what they have got from the meeting. They participated in the meeting, so they have to take responsibility for some of the discussions. But what from their perspectives have they taken away and that we all need to take away? And then we'll open it up for a wider discussion. We'll still aim to close at around 4, despite our late start. So the 4 of you, you know who you are, and I'll introduce you in turn. So I think you all come up and join us at the front. And maybe from the back we can have the main slide, the other slide on to have the holding slide on here for us now. Thank you. So come. We need another chair. We need another chair. That's all right. Oh. I have to be here, I think, to be seen. So, as you've heard, those of you online, we've had an amazing group with us in Addis Ababa this week. From such diverse settings to be able to have a really concrete discussions about pastoralism in different places. And for this final set of reflections, short reflections, we've invited 4 people from very different settings. And I will introduce them now, if I can find the piece of paper that has their names and backgrounds on, which I have done. So I'll introduce them as they come. So we're going to have 4 in a quick fire in a row. So the first presenter is Dr. Shahid Chowdhury. He's secretary to the government of Jammu and Kashmir in India. He's a senior public official who has done extensive work on pastoral development in the region over the last few years, and he's been sharing some really fantastic experiences, and I think he'll reflect on that. And importantly, as he mentioned before, he comes from a pastoral background himself. So, Shahid.
Thank you, sir. I would just say at the beginning that this is a unique platform where we, as policymakers, researchers, development practitioners, intergovernmental organizations, NGOs, and research institutions have collaborated, have discussed over the last 3 days at one platform about the issues and challenges being faced by the pastoral communities. And we have agreed that they represent complex socio-economic and cultural systems in their domains, in their regions, in their areas. And of course, they are vital to our food chain and ecosystem as well. We have agreed on many things that they are vulnerable. These communities are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, disasters, economic exclusion, conflicts, and other issues which are faced by the humanity. So they are the first vulnerable communities which face these challenges. The geopolitical dynamics which we are witnessing between countries in interregional relations, these are leading to ever-evolving power structures, ever-evolving power equations, policies, and decision-making within the countries, within the regions. So this ultimately has an impact on the pastoral communities, and I believe that they have distinct issues, challenges, and problems which need context-specific resolution, context-specific models. Of course, the basic principles remain same as has emerged in the discussion we had over the last 3 days. I would say in this backdrop, the communities have to play a central role. These communities have to be central in our focus of communication, policy, research, and development as well. So from divergent action, as one colleague mentioned, I would say we have to move to convergence. So I will just conclude by enlisting what we all can do in our domains, like the political executive. I think there's a need to integrate the pastoral communities in electoral politics, in democratic systems where they have a say. It's very important that they have a say in the democratic systems. Apart from that, there are international commitments. Say, for example, sustainable development goals, target of 2030, International Year of Rangeland Management 2026. So there are a lot of international commitments where the pastoral communities have to be integrated into political decision-making process. And of course, lastly, the land use legislations, which have to focus on the pastoral communities. As far as policymakers like me are concerned, I think our mandate is inclusive development. So we cannot ensure inclusive development until and unless we are focusing on the pastoral communities, we are excluding them from our development domains. And I think we have a constitutional mandate, a mandate of our service that we should coordinate with research bodies, researchers, and get credible database for very effective and informed decision-making. Apart from that, I think the key responsibility of policymaker right now is the financial policies, financial inclusion of the pastoral communities, and as well as budgeting. Like we discussed about the Indian context, where we are budgeting for the pastoral communities in healthcare, education, veterinary services, and other services. So it's very important that we take care of budgeting as well. Lastly, for policymaker, I think conservation models are successful only when these are community-centric. So in India, we have very effective forest conservation models in many countries which are community-centric, and local administration and the governance system has to go for innovation, use of technology, and informed decision-making about the problems faced by the local pastoral communities. So to conclude, I will say the research institutions have to inform in a community-centric way about the research and the development models and the credible database. So community has to play a central role, and we have to acknowledge the significant role being played by the pastoral communities in the national economies, achieving development goals. And in the end, I would say they have tremendous role in ecosystem goods and services, as well as services for the rangeland management. So I think we have made a right beginning, and this is a great interaction between all the stakeholders. And I think this is the accurate model to address the issues faced by the pastoral communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Shahid. Fantastic reflection from a senior official in a state government, where there's been some incredibly interesting innovations around mobility and transhumance and so on that we've all been learning from. So thank you for coming, and thank you for sharing your experiences. But picking up from what Shahid just mentioned, the importance of including pastoralists in conservation and biodiversity protection, and thinking about pastoralists as integral to complex rangeland ecosystems. Our next commentator is Sargai Shah from Inner Mongolia in northern China. So she works with the Nature Conservancy China program in Inner Mongolia on sustainable land management and with pastoralist community development. And she herself, coming from a pastoralist family, she's absolutely passionate about pastoral development in her home area, as we've learned over the last few days. So, Sargai, please.
Hello. So, as Ian introduced, that I'm Sargai from Inner Mongolia, working for an international conservation organization. And it's been such a great learning retreat in the last few days, and it's so great to hear all the different perspectives and the debates. And it's been really great, and thank you to PASTRES Project and ILRI for providing us this opportunity. So I have 3 points to make today, and hoping to add a conservation practitioners' understanding to the ways forward, the exploration of how development policy can better support pastoralist needs and capacities to work with uncertainty. So my comments today is on only my own view and feelings from this learning, not necessarily represent the organization I work for, nor the country I come from. Okay, so in Land and Environment Group, we discussed a lot about conservation. So people have different kind of perspectives on conservation and preservation. So the past narrative about conservation or like protecting nature is basically about restoring and preserving the nature and wildlife or biodiversity from people. But the new narrative would shift to protecting the nature for sustainable use of nature by human and for human. So I think we need to have a clearer understanding on conservation, this word of conservation, to have a better decision on this conservation kind of project. For instance, like it should be like seeking the ways of sustainable use of pastoralists, sustainable use of nature by pastoralists, rather than excluding the pastoralists. So it comes to my second point of inclusion. So the inclusion of pastoralists in pastoralist perspectives and experience, and also empowering pastoralists through inclusive dialogues and collaborations are very vital, and to the policy making and for the management plans. But how to have an equal and two-way conversations. So it comes to third, through collaboration to seek the ways forward, as we always like talk about respecting the local communities, the pastoralists, not only just seeing them, but thinking like them. So same as to respect the different individual countries, and because each country has its own unique history and culture, and the systems, the unique systems to making the policy and making the management plans. So these kind of two-way kind of understandings would actually lead to a successful collaboration. And I think it is very important. So we need to really understand how the policy is being made, what are the things that are being concerned, and to find the gap to fill in our evidence or findings from research and experience. Thank you.
Fantastic, and so good to hear from a conservation practitioner talking about the integration of conservation and people's livelihoods through an inclusive process. Too often conservation, as you said, is exclusionary, and too often conservation is seen as in opposition to pastoralism. But of course, pastoralists are the very best conservators of land, very best conservationists. So that's a very important lesson for all of us, and particularly to hear this from Inner Mongolia. That's fantastic. So the next person that we've invited to give a short commentary is Michael Odhiambo, who has been working in East African region for many years on pastoral policy. He's an independent consultant, and he works on land and natural resources and environmental processes. And he has huge experience of working with policy processes. So I think he's going to help us think through how the new narrative finds its way into policy. Not an easy task.
Not easy at all. Thank you very much. At the beginning of our meeting, I think it was Dr. Guyoroba who said, he was talking about the Borana specifically, but I think it's true about pastoralists generally, that pastoralism is one of the most researched subjects. So much research is done on pastoralism, and that is confirmed if you look at all the reports here. If you look at the context analysis, you look at the table of references, it's clear pastoralism is really researched. In earlier years, the research was mainly about understanding how pastoralism works, the logic of pastoralism. In more recent years, in the last couple of decades, it's always been about the link between pastoralism as a livelihood and production system and policy and institutional processes that govern countries. And that is why in all the presentations we've had, all the presentations end with a slide on policy implications. That then begs the question, with so much research that makes recommendations, why is it that there's such a wide gap between what pastoralists do and what governments say about pastoralism, or how governments interact with pastoralists? That is the question we need to ask ourselves. And I think one, for me, the starting point is a governance question. When I talk about governance, what I mean is that we have to ask, how do pastoralists interact with power? Or how does power interact with pastoralists? What influence do pastoralists have in the way decisions are made about how the space on which pastoralism is practiced is organized? What influence do pastoralists have in the way that policies stipulate how other land use and production systems interact with pastoralism? And how do we make sure that that happens? I think we have to go back to strengthening the citizenship of pastoralists. Pastoralists are first and foremost citizens of their countries. They have citizenship rights. Those citizenship rights include the right to practice your life, the right to live your culture, the right to relate with your environment in the manner that works best for you. Why is it that other livelihood systems are able to be accommodated in national policies and pastoralism always suffers with the policies? Pastoralism suffers either in situations where there is no policy talking about pastoralism, and the reason they suffer then is because there'll always be policies talking about other land use and production systems. So when they interact, there is a gap with regards to pastoralism, while there are policy stipulations about these other livelihood systems. Or they suffer when there are policies that are directly, contrary to the interests of pastoralism. Sedentarization is one example we all know about, how that works against pastoralism. But pastoralists also suffer when there are policies that are positive to pastoralism because they don't get implemented. And the Kenyan example of the ASAL policy and the community land policy and the Community Land Act and the Community Land Regulations is a case in point. Very positive policies, good practice in good policy making, but they're not being implemented. Why? Because of the governance question. So my challenge for us who are here, whether as policymakers, as NGO actors, or as researchers, is to find explanations or how to strengthen the capacity of pastoralists as an interest group, production system, livelihood system, socio-cultural system, to influence policy processes so that one, they are not hurt, and second, so that their systems are facilitated by policy. Because that's what the entitlement of citizenship is in every country and also under international law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and very good to hear the words power, politics, rights, citizenship in our discussions. These have been running through our discussions, but thank you for bringing them out very forcefully there, because unless these basic questions of democratic accountability and governance are addressed, we can continue making up fantastic new narratives and wonderful new policies to no effect. So somebody who knows quite a lot about this situation will be our final commentator before we open up for wider questions. And please do add questions to the chat or the Q&A if for those of you online, is Verdiana Morandi. She is a member of a transhuman family of sheep breeders in northeastern Italy. We've been learning a lot about her practice, even tasting some of her cheese. She founded APIA, the Italian Shepherds Network, a national association whose goal is the support and social recognition of this activity. And she's also a board member of the European Shepherds Network and WAMIP, where she's actively engaged in international cooperation projects. So, Bediana, over to you.
To come at the end, because I think so much has been said so far, and adding something new is complicated. Anyway, when I approach myself to these kind of meetings, I always ask myself, am I the right person to interpret the needs of so many other people that are currently at home right now, that they are working very, very hard? Because if I'm here, it means there is someone else in the fields that is working hard. Otherwise, if it were so easy to come and state our position, our truth, many more people would do it. But we know it's a 365 days job that doesn't allow nor mobility extra, that it's already been done. So I always hope that I'm a good representative for the category. What I've learned so far, and this is quite striking reality, is that even if I'm presenting Italy and Italian system, I find myself in so many equal situation with the colleagues, fellow that I meet in these international situations. Basically, what we are all experiencing at different extents, but not that much, is basically the same. And even if latitudes changes, the problems remain exactly the same. The things that mostly affects us is that we keep on, as also Michael said a couple of minutes ago, is the fact that we are working on crumbles instead of a framework. And this means that pastoralism doesn't have its own framework to work within, to work on. We see the erosions not only of the rights of citizenship, but going through all the aspects of our life or what other citizens are experiencing. And this is the erosion of pastoralists as community members. We have many social issues that are really destroying our people. We have an erosion as food provider. No one recognizes us as in the field of food sovereignty, which is fundamental, which COVID should have learned also in Western Europe and in the rest of the world. We don't see our recognition as value producers. We are GDP elevators, not suppressors. So how doesn't it come? And then we are land user and enhancer, because ecosystem benefit greatly of our knowledge and also to our will to learn something new, because it's not said that we rely only on old knowledge. We are totally open to understand what comes along. And then we are entrepreneur. And this should be very easy in a world such as ours, but it doesn't look like that. They prefer to assume and base our knowledge on cultural, museum-like situation. We're not, we're entrepreneurs. And we need asset protection, like every other entrepreneur that can insure his capital. Why shouldn't we? So my proposal is, of course, like maybe a socialist, but to unify the issue and let other policy to adapt accordingly, and will be defining our own standards. The second thought I have is this, that we can go from ban to tolerate to promote. And what is typical of a pastoralist is that he has to navigate the ups and downs of life, and he has to find out a way through ban and through tolerating And what happens if resilience is in actual fact self-harm? I'm asking myself, each time we are proposing an alternative solution against, instead, for instance, having a clash, is it good or is it bad? Am I too good? Am I too resilient in a situation that in any other field would have been, in actual fact, very much defined in other situations that would need somehow a revolution? I'm too resilient, maybe. I make myself letting things good, even if they aren't, and we should give up with this attitude. Because it's good to be resilient, it's good to find, for sure, a solution every day. But maybe it's time also to say the solution is over. I need a solution for someone else, and I need a framework that reflects my history and reflects, above all, my future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Verdiana. I think we heard the real sense of where you come from and the connections with many other places around the world that we've heard today. Pastoralists aren't something that can be just ignored on the sidelines of policy. There needs to be central, a framework, as you put it. And to recognize pastoralism as an entrepreneurial activity, deeply embedded in markets, contributing to the national economy, providing the basis for ecosystem protection and so on. A central part of these vast and extensive rangelands that exist across the world. So we've got a good, probably about half an hour. I'm going to go 5 minutes over, and we're going to have a final closing ceremony, so that we can share some questions, comments, and so on from the online audience. And I think the online audience's questions and comments are coming now. First chance. I think it's always fair. I've often been on online meetings, and then people in the room get the first chance. So we're going to start here. Palden has just given me some different comments and questions for the different groups, and I'm going to look at them together. So for the mobility group, there's a question here about the role of school level education, formal and non-formal, and the issues and challenges of providing effective, appropriate education for people on the move. What's the situation now? Can technologies help? And has climate change affected all of this? And another question from Ethiopia: given the fact that there's a devastating drought across the Horn, does the presentation on mobility take account of all of the adaptive and coping strategies in the future, given climate change, and can mobility persist given these contexts? So that was the mobility group. So bear in mind the mobility group, and I'm going to go and ask for the land and environment group. Can you scroll it down? I haven't got enough hands. Fingers. So for the land and environment group, there's a question here about whether state policies, without including expert and people's voices, would be accepted. So what's the role of experts in the policy process, and how do we engage experts as well as people in the policy process? And there's evidence this is a comment from Iran, there's evidence from Iran where in all the policies and all the initiatives, they saw a backward movement. And the reason is that policies were not made and implemented with public consultation. I think this is more of a comment, but how do you make sure that public consultation is central and involves different forms of expertise? And should we have one more Go on then. We'll have one more for the market group, and then we'll leave the others and move on. So given the unfolding catastrophe in terms of loss of livestock and hunger in southern Ethiopia, it would really be good to hear from perspectives on what has caused this and how this forum is used to advocate for pastoralists who've lost their livelihood. So as an impassioned plea, not necessarily related to markets, but in general for our team. And then there's another question. Some pastoralists trying to market camel milk through the local system within Kenya have suffered questions of quality because of transportation problems and unhygienic containers and so on, ferried through public transport. How do you think you can upgrade marketing systems to make it more profitable for these communities? So let's have a few reflections from the people who presented for those three themes. So maybe on mobility, take any of those. I mean, it's not only the person who presented, but Shahid, would you want to talk about schools and?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Yes. Like we discussed different examples from various countries across continents, and in Indian context, we share our Jammu and Kashmir experience, where more than 1,200 pasture schools or seasonal educational centers move with the migratory community, where the education volunteers are recruited from the community, and there are varying models like we discussed in Gujarat. I think, like we discussed previously, that for ensuring service delivery in education, healthcare, livestock care, and other services provided by the government, we have to ensure inclusion, and education is the first thing to begin with.
Reflections from the mobility group on things that were raised. Sorry, I need to be in the front here. On education and mobility. Okay.
I think there's this one.
Yeah, direct responses. Yeah, you can do direct.
Yeah, I can get it quite well now. That question, I think in terms of response to drought, primarily the pastoralists themselves do quite a lot. And if you look at what is going on, despite all these losses of livestock that has been reported and has been seen in northern Kenya, southern Ethiopia, and entire Horn of Africa, the pastoralists have not given up. And if anybody passes through our town centers, you could see lorries and lorries of fodder coming in. And these ones are not supplies from the government or any other support, but through the markets that people still sacrifice all the small resources that they have to purchase this. And secondly, if you look at the extent of mobility that people go into using, all the mechanisms, all the social networks, people have seen a herd that moved from northern Kenya, that is around Moyale, all the way interior of southern Ethiopia, and then back to Kenya into Isiolo, and others proceeded down to Tana River, which is at the coast. So you could see the primary response is by the herd owners themselves, which is, you could see, it's quite extensive. And a lot of times this is not seen also by external eye. But on the other side, there are various other responses that has been talked about through, social protection mechanisms. There's some fodder supplies, forage supplies that has been done by organizations, which you could see it's of course piecemeal, and it's only aimed at saving breeding herds or breeding stocks, such that for continuity purposes, and of course other elements of supportive infrastructure around veterinary services that are also undertaken, because at this particular moment, livestock, when they're under stress, they are quite infected by diseases. So these are some of the things, but the other element of looking forward that we could see is herd owners and families are investing also, in producing fodder, storing fodder, and making sure that they don't wait for external support or buying fodder from these other external sources are quite expensive. They try to get fodder supplies themselves. And finally, the element of diversifying the livestock. You could see even in this kind of time of stress, the main cattle herd owners, they sell their livestock even at very low prices because market collapse, and they buy either goats or camels, which are breeds that at least can withstand the drought better. But this current drought definitely is one of the ones that has gone completely out of hand. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hussein. We had a question about camel milk marketing and upgrading. Guyo's gone out, so Michele has been left. So Michele, you've worked a lot on camel milk. How do you deal with upgrading it and making sure it's linked into effective, profitable markets?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think the case of camel milk marketing is quite illustrative of something that, as it has been stated, used to be a taboo until 20, 30 years ago, and now has become a big business in the region. And I have some experience from Puntland, Somalia, in northern Kenya, in Isiolo, and even now I've heard about what happens in Ethiopia. And there are, well, basically two main ways of trying to assist and to facilitate the marketing and the processing of camel milk. One, that is the very typical one, to build a big plant, a factory where you converge thousands of liters of milk every day, you pasteurize it, and then you send it to the market well packaged. That is very often non-consistent and not very effective, because most of these factories, they ended up being shut down because they are not, they don't comply, they're not nested into the local economic and social setting. The other system is try to look at the way the system works, that is through networks, very often managed by women, that day by day, they improve their practices, their techniques, they have jerry cans, they try to improve the way the jerry cans are cleaned, they use smoking, they use water, they use clean water, they use soaps, and then the processing through a network of freezers that are displayed along the route. So it's not one center, but very many different small coolers. So there are two main ways of trying to provide inputs and assistance to pastoral marketing in the case of camel milk. One is big investments in one place that's centralized in a very hierarchical way and centralize everything, and very often they don't work to the experience that we have up to now. The other one is try to understand and work with a network of local agents and actors that try to test and to improve their own techniques and practices, but they are very jealous about the autonomy they have into the system. So you don't kind of centralize, you don't take the power out of the system, you don't take the responsibility out of the system. And that is the best way, in my experience and in what I've seen in the region, to keep on improving the quality of milk and to definitely to facilitate and to enhance, to foster that kind of marketing.
That's great. And we have a couple of questions that I want to go back to, the one that was posed from Iran. Also, how to get public consultation and pastoral involvement into policy processes, because the questioner reflected that in the Iranian situation, this has gone backwards over the years, and the pastoralists aren't involved. But there was another question also, is what's the role of the media? The role of the media in giving pastoralists a profile, a positive profile, and how does that help in shifting policy? So I don't know whether there's anyone on the panel here who would like to reflect on public consultations or media, or Michael, maybe? Well, okay. We'll mix it up.
The problem with the policy, it's very specific. Policies are made at national level. So the policy context vary from country to country. If we take the example of Kenya, public participation is now a constitutional imperative, which means that the government has an obligation to consult the public whenever it is making any policy. So that is probably one of the strongest ways in which to ensure that the public inputs inform policy processes. But of course, it is one thing to have that kind of provision in the constitution and in the policy. And in Kenya, even subnational governments are enacting public participation legislation in order to implement that constitutional provision. But it is another thing to ensure that public participation happens and is informed, because the experience we've had in Kenya over the last three stages of devolution, that a lot of public participation at the local level is reduced to just ticking boxes. So they call people to a meeting, the decision has already been made, they're given some little entertainment, there, some soda, they have a list of participants, and the report will show that there has been public participation. So the second, which I think is the better way to go, is to strengthen, as I said earlier on, citizenship, to ensure that we create, that the public are aware, pastoralists are aware of their rights and of the obligations that governments have towards them. Often policy reform addresses what I call the supply side of governance, which is creating laws, doing policies, structuring institutions. But the supply side of governance is only useful if the demand side, which is the citizen asking to ensure that making demands on institutions to deliver on their rights and duties, if that is strengthened, that is when we have public participation. So I would say that depending on the context, where it is possible, entrenching it in law, embedding it in the constitution, and having policies is one way, is the surest way. But even without that, strengthening the demand by citizens of their rights, by creating awareness, empowerment, letting them understand how policy processes work, enabling them to know how to make demands and how to monitor policy implementation is what I would recommend. In Kenya, the media talk about pastoralists during drought or when there's a conflict between pastoralism and conservation. That's when you see pastoralism in the media. I think the challenge we have here is, one, to educate the media, because a lot of the media coverage is really, when you read it, if you understand pastoralism, it's extremely ignorant. You know, this expression about wandering about is often in the media. Pastoralists are wandering about, wandering aimlessly. You know, it's because they don't understand the logic of pastoralism. So one thing is to educate the media. The fact that you have a microphone in front of you, or you have a typewriter or a computer in front of you and a title making you a media person, doesn't mean you know anything, or doesn't mean you know everything. So we need to deliberately educate the media about pastoralism, about why pastoralists do what they do and why it is important to understand that. But the second thing is also, for, again, going back to citizenship, is for citizens to make demands on media houses. Now in East Africa, we have a lot of local media houses. We have FM stations everywhere. How much use are we making of these media houses to be able to educate the general public, but also strengthen pastoralists about how to make demands on their rights? I think that would be the way to go.
Very good. I agree entirely. Yes, there's clapping in the room. I'm sure there's clapping online. And if there are any journalists online, come and be in touch. We're going to allow the room here a little bit of a chance to say anything. Any questions, comments for 5 minutes or so. So have people, Julia has got something.
Very quickly, because thank you, Michael, for what you said, because it was great. I agree with everything you said. Just wanted to add that in public participation, I think that the word facilitation is also key. So it's not enough to have a pastoralist or 10 pastoralists around the table unless you create the conditions for them to meaningfully participate into the policy processes. And that is often forgotten in government discussions or public policy discussions, as well as in projects. Because now in Europe, but anywhere as well, participation is key in projects, but is often very symbolic and empty, while true participation, I think, happens through facilitation, I think.
Thank you for that. Any other thoughts and comments from within the room? Yes, please.
Chana. I work with the county government of Solo. My reflection from yesterday and today is that, I was working with the NGOs for the last 10 years. Then I joined the county government. First is there are a lot of challenges in terms of the laws that the laws we are implementing also at the county level sometimes is not reflective to the needs of the pastoralists in terms of how even how we spend money. We follow both the county governments and the national government follow the laws of the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act. If you look at the law, it's not reflective to the need of the pastoralist. That I think needs to change with time. And the other issue is the issue of we have a department in all the northern counties. We have Department of Livestock, where we have the veterinary officers, doctors, we have animal health workers. All these guys, we employ, we give them salaries, but they are all the time stationed in the locations. They are posted in our locations. That they are the mentality of the civil service, that they are working as a formal job, working in town, working in the offices. As animal health workers, we are supposed to be embedded with the pastoralists, with the animals. My reflection is that we are trying to reflect, even some 1 month ago, that we need the Department of Livestock, not only for Isiolo, for all the pastoralists, government working for the pastoralists even in southern Ethiopia and also in northern Kenya, need to be relevant to the needs of the pastoralists. Why? Because they are taxpayers and the mobility is tied to their livelihood, and they have development rights. They need development services from the government. And because they are on the move, the government needs to be reflected in terms of now the Department of Livestock having a mobile unit in terms of the services, in terms of the needs, in terms of not only for the Department of Livestock, but all the service departments that are supposed to help the pastoralists, whether it is health, whether it is livestock, need to be embedded with the moving population. That is my reflective, and we shall implement in Solo how we are going to deploy staff and all those things so that they move with the population.
Thank you, Talat. I mean, this is a real dilemma. How do you make the state mobile? The state has a very fixed notion of itself. People want to live and work in town, but how do you get people out there to be working with pastoralists? How do you get services out there to be mobile? And we've learned a lot about this from India, but we've also been sharing experiences from other parts of the world. And I think this is a really key way, but it requires a basic reimagining of the state and the reimagining of the roles of people within the state. Any other thoughts and comments from the floor? So we've got two more here. I want a bit more diversity in my, given it's International Women's Day, so we're not only having men doing the commentaries. So put up your hands, please, more broadly. But we'll have who has got comments? Put your hands up. I haven't seen you. Don't be shy. Okay, we've got Jarta at the back. And then we've got Abhijit. Yeah, okay, well, build up your questions because we're going to just have a very quick round of questions or comments right now. So, yes, you can do it from there, I think.
Do I need to stand?
No, you can. I think it's.
Okay, thank you. I don't know whether
you may have to have this.
To the mic. This is just meant for sitting. Okay, I would prefer that.
Joshua, you sit. Doesn't work? We won't see you, but
okay, they want to see me. Thank you. I think I have listened for the 3 days, and I also worked with the land group yesterday and today. mind all over the world of pastoralists, there is undeclared land war going on everywhere. And everything around pastoralists, not only land. I thought it was just happening to us. And we need really to do something about how do we make it easy for pastoralists not to be perpetually in the situation of conflict and not in a conflicting situation. I think they are citizens of the world and very productive citizens who produce a lot to keep many of the goods and services that we need to be appreciated. And one of the things I think we need to focus on is to really analyze how are these wars created. And they are never declared, but they go on forever. I think it's time either to declare this war so that there is a way to find out to making peace, or help pastoralists really to fight one single war at a time. We find ourselves fighting many of them. Thank you.
So those of you who couldn't see, that was Darso Moku from the Drylands Learning and Capacity Building Initiative from Nairobi, Kenya. I've forgotten who else was. Anna, did you want to say something? Anna, go on then, do. Introduce yourself if you can.
Thanks everyone. Anna Okello from the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. Thank you so much for the panel. I really enjoyed all your comments and thoughts. And I guess I was thinking as you were all speaking, and I was thinking around a lot of the stuff that I sort of do in my role is have lots of discussions with government ministers and decision makers around resource allocation. And I guess if there's one thing that I've observed over the years is that agriculture as a sector is not as politically powerful as mining or, you know, some of these other things. So I think we have to bear that in mind, because livestock is not as politically powerful as cropping or some of these other agricultural commodities. And it all comes back to generation of gross national income. And, you know, how can we build up better the evidence and the arguments for livestock ministers to actually argue their case in Treasury and some of these other places. So, you know, we talk a lot about power and politics on the ground. There's equivalent power and politics at, you know, national policy levels and within ministries themselves. So I think that was sort of one comment. And then the other thing I really liked your comments, Michael, on governance and the difference between governance and government. And sometimes we confuse, or people confuse these. But I think when we think about policy process analysis, trying to, you know, acknowledge that we talk a lot about evidence and the need for evidence. I'm a big believer in evidence. I work for a research organization, but we all know that policy is not a rational linear process, and often policies are made in the absence of any sort of evidence. So I guess thinking around how do we get better at understanding, yes, policy process analysis is one of those instruments we've got, but realizing that it may not even be evidence that triggers support to some of these institutions and some of these communities, and what other tools can we think of a bit outside the box. Thank you.
Very good points, and really echoes what Salah said before about budget allocation and so on. Echi, you're going to come next. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Ishi Gabbard, coordinator of the Lands of the Future initiative. And I really thank all of you for these very diverse insights. Something that really struck me was a sentence, and I'm really thankful for that. Actually, it was a question. Am I too resilient? Thank you for this question, because I think this could be a turning point question to ask when you ask yourself, especially also in face of the drought that is happening here, am I too resilient? And when it's the time to start demanding more? And I think we all have been thinking about that demanding more from pastoralists, from states, from their states, is overdue. And this question, when am I too resilient? My livestock is dying, my people are dying. This is the time to really wake up people. And thank you for this really wonderful question that can stand in the room and go on with us to do more.
I agree entirely. So thank you, Viviana. Abhijit, you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Ian. Myself, Abhijit Mitra, Animal Husbandry Commissioner from Government of India. My role is particularly policy making and policy implementation. Well, I have three quick one-liner. First of all, I have loudly started thinking that whether in a world's perspective, we should use pastoralism or extensive livestock so that we are living, when you are telling pastoralism, there are many people who practice animal husbandry extensive way, but they are not true pastoralists. So that could be one, you can give a thought about that. Second thing, when we talk about veterinary services or animal husbandry services, what our experience in India says that when you train people within the community as a para-veterinarian or animal husbandry practitioner, they play a better role than looking at the states or the ministry or the health service provider, whether it's a human or at the animals. Second. Third, I just echo what she said, that livestock sector as such is not as powerful as a crop husbandry. It is true with anywhere, any minister, if you want to say a portfolio of animal husbandry in comparison to agriculture, he's a little unhappy. And within the animal husbandry, pastoralism is again a little bit poorer. And final thing, I think in the next room, one is going on. There is a one issue, one we should not forget today with the pandemic we just overcome, that One Health initiative should be one of the very important narratives within the pastoralism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Couldn't agree more. Yeah, very briefly introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. My name is Hassan Roba. From Kenya, I work for Christensen Fund. Just want to make a brief comment about the evidences that has been produced. We've all agreed that all over the years, we have done a lot of research and produced enough evidences, but then we see there's a bottleneck in terms of policies making to actual decisions. I think we have talked about, Michael, for example, said that pastoralists are not engaging the policy process as effectively as they should. While I agree with that, I also feel that as researchers, people who develop these evidences, also to make enough effort in terms of making these evidences available to the people make decisions. So there needs to be filling this interface and see how best we can package our research so that it finds itself in the right place. Thank you very much.
Very good point. Right, we're going to have two last questions. Tahira, you introduce yourself.
All right. Thank you very much. I am Tahira Mohammed. I'm from Kenya, part of PASTRES PhD team. I just want to echo, especially to my Kenyan counterparts who are here today. We've had these 3 wonderful days, and as we know, we have lots of publication and research on Kenya and pastoralism. So I think linking this to media point, like it is our call and it is our role at least to decide on the next steps. Like just coming here and discussing all this policy narrative is a good step, but then I am really looking forward to seeing action, especially from researchers and practitioners linking to this, especially in this, the current government have a climate committee, especially formed after the COP27. So where do we come in as researchers? What is our contribution? What is our role in changing this narrative and also changing this policy frameworks into actions, especially for pastoral areas? So it's a call that I'm making to all the Kenyan participants here and also across the other region. Let us think of way forward, please. Let it not end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tahira. Glad to hear you're pushing us forward, and we'll have one final comment or question.
It's actually a comment, and I think the 3 days have been very inspiring here, and I was really inspired by what's happening in Kashmir, and Jumna, you call it here, those two areas, especially when they provide these services to the mobile community. And I still feel it is something really to be replicated and something to really look upon, to copy in our respective areas. Looking at provision of education, provision of healthcare, and provision of transport really struck. That one really come out very well, and it's really an amazing thing and a good thing to hear that some part of this world, really the mobile communities are taken care of. I agree with what Michael said. In Kenyan context, you know, you are on your own, you sort yourself as you move. We say kujipanga ukitembea. So you just sort yourself, but hearing that, it's quite inspiring. The other is, of course, the many policy frameworks that we have, and the lack of, we've been speaking about it for the 3 days, the lack of implementation action that is lacking is really what is ailing us. Like Tahira said, we have very good papers, we have very good writing on papers, but the implementation part is really something we need to focus on. We spoke yesterday about the financing bit. Of course, this also comes with a cost, and there is need for us to really look into how we finance this implementation action points.
Thank you very much. I think there's a bigger consensus that moving from research to action and thinking about the nature and the politics of policy processes is an absolutely essential next step. We can't solve all the problems of the world's pastoral regions in a single workshop, but I hope that those of you online, and thank you for sticking with us despite starting late, those of you online, those of you here have got a few ideas to take forward in your particular places. I mean, there are a lot of emerging platforms, regional platforms, national platforms, and of course, the International Year for Rangelands and Pastoralism, which is in 2026, but of course, there are several years of build up to that. And I think that will be an incredibly important moment for all of us who are concerned with pastoral systems around the world to come together and really push on the policy front at the international level. So I'd like to thank all of the speakers, all of the commentators, all of you in the room here, all of you online, to ILRI, our hosts, to Natasha Maru, who has been holding the whole thing together. And we hope very much that this will not be the end of the conversation. You can continue to engage with the PASTRES research through our website, pastres.org, and follow us on Twitter and engage with all of the exciting things that are going to happen. We'll report on this workshop in due course and share the videos and the findings of this workshop through our normal channels. So thank you very much. We want to close with a slightly different way of closing, because as we recognize right at the beginning of the session, this is International Women's Day. We have been talking about the power relations that exist within societies, the gendered violence that exists, and the processes by which gender equality and inclusion can happen in development more broadly and pastoralism in particular. So I'm going to call on Hiba to come and do the final closing in the form of a song. Come here.
Go.
when a man falls in love with a woman and he wants to marry her, he would offer her something very valuable in the value of her charm. And the song I'm gonna sing talks about a man expressing his love to a woman through offering her a flock of camels. So he sets his tent in front of her house and he expresses his love with his most valuable gift. That's how valuable is the woman, and that's how valuable are the camels. It's a Tunisian song. Okay. الباب طريق نصف الخيام نصف الخيام طبالي يا اضرب زرنا وراك ساريا ويا لله ما أحلى كموني وريني الدار خلي نزوري يا لله ما أحلى كموني وريني الدار خلي نزوري ندي لي خير الله بالماء بنوري المسمية في الطريق الوانا يا جمالي. And I would like to translate the song. So it says, at your door, they set up tents. Drums are rolling, and beauties were dancing and playing. Oh, saint, Mazin, who's a saint woman, the queen of homelands, please advise me. On the track running along the river, oh, woman of Jamal, so she's a very beautiful woman from a tribe called Jamal. Oh, woman of Jamal, oh, how beautiful you are. Show me the house so I can come and visit you. I will offer you camels. I will offer you a khilla, which is a traditional jewelry. A khilla shining in your color, in your beauty. Oh, my celestial. This is for women, and this is for the camels too. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hiba, and thank you, everybody. What a lovely way to end the meeting, and happy International Women's Day to everyone. That's it.